Michael couldn't explain what unsettled him most about that Tuesday night. It wasn't the divorce papers resting between them on the kitchen table. It was Grace. She looked at the folder for a moment, almost as if she'd been expecting it long before he found the courage to slide it across the table. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't accuse him. She didn't even hesitate. She signed every page with steady hands, gently pushed the folder back toward him, and quietly said, "I hope this brings you the peace you've been looking for." Then she picked up her coffee mug and walked upstairs. Michael stayed exactly where he was, waiting for the sound of a door slamming, or quiet sobbing, or anything that made sense. The house never made a sound. Several minutes later, his eyes settled on a small notebook she'd forgotten on her chair, its edges stained with blue paint. Until that moment, he had believed the hardest part of the evening was over. He had no idea that what waited inside those pages would force him to question almost 15 years of marriage in ways he never imagined. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. Long before either of them could imagine divorce papers lying on their kitchen table, Michael and Grace were the couple everyone quietly rooted for. They met in their early 20s at a neighborhood charity fundraiser in Asheville, North Carolina. Michael had volunteered because a coworker convinced him to help set up tables for a scholarship dinner. Grace was there with a local community arts group, arranging handmade centerpieces that children from nearby schools had painted. Their first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It started because Michael accidentally picked up one of the painted jars, assuming it belonged with the empty decorations. Grace laughed. "That's not decoration," she said, smiling as she took it from his hands. "A 10-year-old worked on that for 3 weeks." Michael looked genuinely embarrassed. "I almost threw away a masterpiece." She tilted the jar toward the light. "I wouldn't go that far." "I don't know," he replied. "I've seen expensive art that made a lot less sense." She laughed again, this time loud enough that 2 volunteers glanced in their direction. It wasn't a dramatic beginning. There was no instant declaration that they had found the love of their lives. It simply felt easy. Neither of them spent the evening trying to impress the other. By the time the fundraiser ended, they were folding tablecloths together, talking about favorite restaurants, terrible first jobs, and how neither of them could keep houseplants alive for very long. When Michael asked if she wanted to have coffee sometime, Grace answered without pretending to think about it. "I'd like that." That was how it started. Not with fireworks, with comfort, the kind that made silence feel natural instead of awkward. Over the next 2 years, they built a relationship through ordinary moments. Saturday mornings, wandering farmers markets, long drives through the Blue Ridge Mountains with no destination in mind. Cheap diners where they always ordered dessert before deciding whether they were still hungry. Grace liked collecting little traditions. Michael discovered he liked them too. She insisted they take 1 photograph every month, no matter how ordinary the day seemed. Sometimes they stood outside their apartment holding grocery bags. Sometimes they were covered in flour after trying another recipe that didn't quite work. Sometimes they were sitting on the living room floor, assembling secondhand furniture. Grace would always say the same thing before pressing the camera button. "Someday, we'll forget today unless we keep it." Michael teased her about it. "You planning to write our biography?" "No." She tucked the camera back into her purse. "I'm planning to remember." When Michael proposed, he didn't plan anything elaborate. He waited until they were sitting on the old wooden bench overlooking Lake Julian, a place they visited often because Grace claimed it helped her think. He pulled the ring from his jacket pocket. "I had a speech." Grace smiled. "What happened to it?" "I forgot every word." "I figured. So." He laughed nervously. "You already know I love you." "I do. I can't imagine building a life with anyone else." She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." He blinked. "Catching up?" "I decided months ago." She held out her left hand. "You were the one taking your time." Years later, Michael would remember that afternoon more clearly than many business meetings he once believed were important. Back then, though, It simply felt like the beginning of everything. Marriage suited them, not because it was effortless, because they enjoyed sharing responsibility. When one of them cooked, the other cleaned. If Michael worked late one evening, Grace handled dinner without complaint. When Grace stayed up finishing projects for work, Michael packed lunches for the next morning before she even asked. Their partnership grew through dozens of tiny choices neither of them kept score of. Their first home wasn't large. It sat on a quiet street outside Charlotte, with white siding that needed repainting and a front porch just wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. Grace loved those chairs before they even moved in. "We're buying them." Michael looked at the price tag. "We haven't bought the house yet." "We will." "You sound very confident." She shrugged. "I already know where the Christmas lights are going." He laughed. "We haven't signed anything." "We will." They did. Over the years, the porch became the place where most evenings ended. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they watched summer storms roll across the neighborhood without saying much at all. Children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Someone down the block almost always grilled too much food and insisted everyone stop by for a plate. It wasn't an extraordinary neighborhood. That was exactly why Grace loved it. Life settled into a rhythm that felt dependable. Then their daughter was born. 2 years later, their son arrived. The house immediately became louder, messier, and somehow happier. Friday nights belonged to homemade pizza. The children covered the dough with far more toppings than anyone could reasonably eat. Michael always pretended to complain. "One day, you're going to invent pizza soup." Their daughter would grin. "It'll still taste good." Sunday mornings meant pancakes. Michael never mastered making the first one correctly. Grace claimed it was impossible. The first pancake belongs to the pan. Michael insisted the pan had developed expensive taste. Their children laughed every single time, even after hearing the joke dozens of times. Grace began another family tradition not long after. Every birthday, each person wrote a handwritten letter to whoever was celebrating. Not a greeting card, a real letter. What they admired, a favorite memory, something they hoped for the year ahead. The letters were folded carefully and placed inside a wooden keepsake box that Grace kept on the bookshelf in the living room. When the children asked why they couldn't simply text birthday messages like everyone else, Grace smiled. "Phones get replaced." She gently closed the lid of the box. "Handwriting stays." Michael agreed without hesitation. Some evenings, after the children were asleep, they would pull out older letters and read them aloud. They laughed at childish spelling mistakes, remembered forgotten vacations, and teased each other about promises that had seemed enormous at the time. Those moments reminded them how much life had already changed. During their first anniversary as husband and wife, they drove to the coast before sunrise. They watched the sky slowly brighten while sitting on a blanket with coffee balanced between them. Grace rested her head against Michael's shoulder. "I want us to promise each other something." "What?" "No matter what life looks like 10 years from now." She paused, watching the waves. "This day belongs to us." Michael turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "No work. No work. No errands. Done. No family obligations." He smiled. "We're eliminating everybody." She laughed. "Just for one day." He reached for her hand. "I can do one day." Grace squeezed his fingers. "Even if we're busy." "Especially then. Even if we have children. We'll find someone to babysit." "Even if your job gets demanding?" Michael answered without needing to think. "I don't want to become the kind of husband who's always promising next time." Grace studied him for a second, then nodded. "Good." He kissed her forehead. "So it's settled." "It is." Neither of them imagined that the promises most likely to be broken were usually the ones made with complete sincerity. The promotion arrived on an ordinary Wednesday. Michael almost missed the call because he was helping their son build a cardboard castle on the living room floor. His phone buzzed twice. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and stood. "I'll be right back." Their son looked up from the pile of tape. "You promise?" Michael smiled. "I promise." Grace caught his eye from the kitchen and lifted her coffee mug. "Take your time." 5 minutes later, he walked back into the room, wearing an expression she had never seen before. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the children. "I think—" He laughed once, almost in disbelief. "I got it." Grace already knew. "The promotion?" He nodded. She crossed the room before he could say another word and wrapped both arms around him. "I'm so proud of you." Their daughter looked between them. "Does this mean we're rich now?" Michael laughed. "Not exactly." Their son raised one hand. "Can we still get Pizza Friday?" Grace smiled. "I think we'll manage." That night, they celebrated at the little Italian restaurant where they had gone on their third date. Nothing about the place had changed. The owner still greeted them by name. The booths were still a little too small. The garlic bread still disappeared before the entrees arrived. Michael talked about the new position with the excitement of someone finally seeing years of effort recognized. "It's a big step," he said. "More responsibility, bigger clients, a chance to lead the regional team." Grace listened with the same attention she always gave him. "You've worked hard for this." "I know it'll be busy at first." "At first," she repeated with an encouraging smile. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I mean it. Once I settle into the role, things will level out." She believed him, not because she was naive, because every reason he gave sounded reasonable. For the first few months, the changes hardly seemed worth mentioning. Michael left home a little earlier, came back a little later, answered a few more emails after dinner. The family adjusted without much discussion. When work called during a Saturday soccer game, he stepped away for 10 minutes. "I'm sorry," he whispered as he sat back down beside Grace. "They needed an answer." "It's okay." And she meant it. When he missed one family movie night because a client flew in unexpectedly, the children complained more than Grace did. Their daughter folded her arms. "Dad always says Friday is family night." Michael knelt beside her. "I know. You missed it." "I did. I don't like when work wins." He smiled sadly. "It won't always." Grace placed a gentle hand on their daughter's shoulder. "Dad's trying." Michael looked at her with quiet gratitude. She had a way of easing tension before it had the chance to settle into the room. Weeks became months. The promotion brought raises, better benefits, and a sense of security they hadn't had before. They replaced the aging washing machine that seemed to break every other week, finally fixed the leak over the garage, started a college savings account for both children. Michael saw those things as proof that every long day meant something. Whenever guilt crept in, he reminded himself why he was working so hard. This is for them. That thought became easier to repeat than harder questions. Am I still here enough? Grace never tried to compete with his job. She understood ambition. She had one of her own. She simply wanted there to be room for both. Some mornings, she packed his lunch before leaving for work herself. She tucked little notes between the sandwich and the fruit. "Hope today is kinder than yesterday. Good luck with the presentation. Don't forget, you're coming home to people who love you." The notes always made Michael smile. Sometimes he texted her a picture of one. Other times he forgot until he found it while throwing away the lunch bag at the office. Even then, he slipped the note into his wallet instead of the trash. He never stopped appreciating her. He simply stopped finding enough time to show it. The business trips started during the second year after the promotion. At first, they were only 2 or 3 days at a time. Atlanta, Richmond, Nashville, then Chicago, then Dallas. Each trip came with the same conversation. "I'll make it up to you." Grace would nod. "I know." And she believed that too. The first time he missed their son's school play, he watched a video Grace recorded on her phone while sitting alone in a hotel room. Their son played a tree. He had exactly 2 lines. Michael laughed when the audience applauded anyway. He called as soon as it ended. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Grace said. "He looked for you before the curtain opened." Michael closed his eyes. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "What truth?" "That you wanted to be there." There was no accusation in her voice. That somehow made it harder. By the time winter arrived, Michael had developed a habit he didn't even notice. Every evening, he walked through the front door carrying more than his laptop. He carried unfinished meetings, client deadlines, tomorrow's presentation, problems that followed him into the living room before he had even taken off his coat. Grace learned to recognize the distant look in his eyes. Sometimes she waited until after dinner to tell him something. Sometimes until the children were asleep. Sometimes until the weekend. One evening, she walked into the home office, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You need a break." Michael didn't look away from his computer. "Give me 15 minutes. She set the mug beside him. "Okay." The tea was cold by the time he noticed it. He found her folding laundry downstairs. "I'm sorry." She smiled. "I know." He kissed her forehead. "I'll do better tomorrow." "I know." Neither of them realized they had started repeating the same promises in different forms. Tomorrow, next weekend, after this project, when things settle down. The words always sounded temporary. The routine they created wasn't. Spring arrived with warmer evenings and longer daylight. One Saturday afternoon, Grace spread a picnic blanket across the backyard while the children chased each other with water balloons. Michael stepped outside with his phone pressed to his ear. He held up one finger. "Just a minute." Grace smiled at the children and kept arranging sandwiches. 20 minutes later, she packed everything back into the basket. Not angrily, simply because the food had started attracting flies. Michael ended the call and looked around. "Did I miss lunch?" Grace picked up the basket. "We'll try another day." He reached for her arm. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said it gently, but for the first time, the words sounded tired instead of reassuring. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Michael found her sitting alone on the front porch. He lowered himself into the rocking chair beside her. "You've been quiet today." Grace looked out toward the street, where porch lights were beginning to glow. "I'm okay." "You sure?" She turned and smiled. "I'm sure." It wasn't a dishonest answer. She was okay. She simply wasn't sure how many more another days a marriage could quietly collect before they started becoming something else. Michael reached over and took her hand. She squeezed his fingers back. Neither of them noticed how easy it had become to mistake holding on for staying connected. The upstairs room had always been the smallest room in the house. When they first moved in, Michael imagined turning it into a home office. Grace suggested waiting until they knew what their family needed most. Over the years it became a nursery, then a storage room filled with holiday decorations, old toys, boxes of family photographs, and furniture they kept promising to donate. One Saturday morning, Grace carried the last box downstairs. Michael watched her from the hallway. "Cleaning project?" She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been meaning to do it for a while." "You finally won the battle against the storage room?" She laughed. "I wouldn't celebrate yet." He kissed the side of her head before grabbing his car keys. "I'll be back before dinner. Drive safely." By the time he returned that evening, the door upstairs was closed. Not locked. Just closed. That became the beginning of a routine neither of them questioned. Some evenings, after dinner and homework were finished, Grace disappeared upstairs for an hour or two. Sometimes she came back humming to herself. Sometimes she returned, carrying nothing at all. Occasionally there were tiny streaks of blue, green, or white paint on the side of her hand. Michael noticed them once while they were loading the dishwasher. "What happened there?" She glanced down at her fingers and smiled. "I made a mess." "Doing what?" "Just organizing a few things." He nodded. "As long as you're not organizing explosives." She rolled her eyes. "You've watched too many crime shows." He laughed, and the conversation drifted somewhere else. He never asked again. There didn't seem to be a reason to. Grace had always enjoyed creative projects. Over the next several months, small deliveries began arriving at the house. Canvas, paint, brushes, wooden frames. Most packages showed up while Michael was at work. When he noticed them stacked near the front door, Grace simply carried them upstairs before dinner. One evening, their daughter started climbing the stairs with a bowl of popcorn. Grace smiled. "Not tonight, sweetheart." "Why?" "I want to finish something first." "Can I see it tomorrow?" "We'll see." Their daughter pouted dramatically. "You're mysterious." Grace laughed. "I promise I'm not building a spaceship." Their son looked up from the couch. That sounds exactly like something someone building a spaceship would say. Even Michael laughed at that. The room upstairs became part of the family's rhythm. No one treated it as unusual. Everyone simply accepted that it was Grace's space. And in a house where she spent most of her time taking care of everyone else, Michael was glad she finally had something that belonged only to her. He never stopped to wonder why she needed a room where she could close the door. Life continued moving at its familiar pace. Their daughter entered high school. Their son became tall enough to borrow Michael's jackets. Michael's responsibilities at work kept growing. He traveled more often than he stayed home some months. Still, Grace kept reaching toward him in ways so ordinary they were almost invisible. She brought him coffee before sunrise on mornings she knew he had important presentations. She left homemade muffins beside his laptop before early conference calls. She sent simple text messages during the day. "Good luck today. Drive carefully. The kids miss you." Sometimes he answered immediately. Sometimes hours later. Sometimes he read the messages while walking into another meeting and forgot to reply until bedtime. Grace never mentioned it. One rainy Thursday evening, she found an old DVD while cleaning the living room cabinet. Michael looked up from his laptop. "What did you find?" She held up the case with a grin. "Our first terrible movie." He smiled immediately. "I forgot that existed. You promised we'd watch it every anniversary." "I did?" "You absolutely did." He leaned back in his chair. "I must have been very optimistic." "You were." She placed the DVD beside his computer. "The kids are staying at your sister's tomorrow night." Michael looked at the date in the corner of his screen. Friday, their anniversary. For a moment, he smiled. Then the smile faded. His calendar was full. A client from Raleigh had moved an important meeting to Friday afternoon. There were documents he still hadn't finished. He hated what he was about to say. "Grace." She looked at him without speaking. "I completely forgot." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't think I can get out of this meeting." She stood quietly for a second. Not angry, not surprised. She picked up the DVD. "Okay." Michael closed his laptop halfway. "I'll make it up to you." "I know. We can celebrate Saturday." She gave him a small smile. "Maybe." "I mean it." "I know you do." There was something about the way she answered that made him hesitate. It wasn't disappointment anymore. Disappointment usually reached toward the future. This sounded more like someone putting something back on a shelf because they had stopped expecting to use it. The next afternoon, Michael left for work before sunrise. Grace was already awake. She handed him a travel mug of coffee. "Drive safely." He kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry about today." She smiled. "I hope your meeting goes well." He wanted her to say they would celebrate tomorrow. She didn't. By the time he returned home that evening, the house was dark except for the lamp above the kitchen sink. The children were still spending the night with Michael's sister. His father had already gone to bed. Grace wasn't downstairs. Michael found a small plate in the refrigerator. His favorite meal, covered carefully with foil. A handwritten note rested beside it. "Happy anniversary. Dinner's in the fridge. Don't forget to eat." There wasn't another word. No complaint. No sadness. No reminder of the promise they had made years earlier while watching the sunrise over the ocean. Michael stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes. He looked toward the staircase. The upstairs light was glowing beneath the closed door. Faint music drifted into the hallway. He almost walked up there. Almost knocked. Almost suggested they open the old DVD anyway, even if it was late. Instead, his phone vibrated. Another email. Another problem that couldn't wait until morning. He answered it standing in the kitchen. By the time he finished, the light upstairs had gone out. The next morning, Grace greeted everyone with pancakes, coffee, and the same warm smile she always wore. She laughed when their son burned the first pancake. She teased Michael about adding too much syrup. No one mentioned the anniversary, not because it didn't matter, because pretending everything was fine felt easier than admitting something precious had slipped quietly past both of them. And without either of them realizing it, that became the first promise they broke together, and the one neither ever truly repaired. Life didn't become worse overnight. It simply became more organized. Grace kept a calendar on the side of the refrigerator. Every square seemed to belong to someone else. Doctor appointments for Michael's father, parent-teacher conferences, soccer practice, dance rehearsals, utility reminders, grocery lists, birthdays she refused to forget. Some mornings, she looked at it while drinking her coffee and realized there wasn't a single note about herself. She folded the thought away and started the day anyway. Michael's career continued moving upward. His name appeared on company newsletters. Clients requested him by name. Promotions led to larger projects, and larger projects led to more travel. Whenever someone congratulated Grace, she smiled. "He works hard," she always said. No one asked how hard she worked. She didn't resent Michael's success. She had celebrated every milestone with him. What became difficult was realizing their lives were beginning to run alongside each other instead of together. One Tuesday evening, Michael called while driving home. "I'm going to be late." Grace glanced at the casserole sitting on the stove. "Everything okay?" "Client dinner. I thought that was tomorrow." "It was. They changed it." "I'm sorry." "So am I. I'll keep your plate warm." There was a short silence. "Don't wait up if it gets too late," he said. "Okay." After they hung up, she carried his plate into the refrigerator instead. The children didn't seem surprised. Their daughter asked, "Dad working again?" Grace nodded. "He'll be home later." Their son shrugged and reached for another dinner roll. The conversation moved on. That bothered Grace more than she expected. It had become normal. As the months passed, she stopped asking Michael what time he thought he'd be home. She had learned the answer wasn't really a time. It was a hope, and hopes changed. Instead, she texted practical things. "Your dad took his medication. Emma needs the permission slip signed. Milk's almost gone." Michael always answered those messages, sometimes immediately, sometimes an hour later. Their conversations slowly became efficient, necessary, almost nothing else. One Saturday morning, Grace walked into Michael's home office holding 2 travel mugs. "I was thinking." He looked up from his laptop. The weather's nice?" He smiled without lifting his hands from the keyboard. "It is. We could drive to the lake." He glanced at the clock. "I've got a deadline." "It doesn't have to be today. Maybe tomorrow?" She nodded. "Maybe." By Sunday afternoon, another work emergency had taken its place. Grace didn't ask again. It wasn't a decision she made all at once. It happened one invitation at a time. She stopped suggesting coffee before work, stopped asking if he wanted to watch old movies after the children went to bed, stopped reminding him about neighborhood festivals she knew he would probably miss. None of it came from anger. It came from experience. Michael noticed she had become easier to live with. There were fewer difficult conversations, fewer disappointed expressions, less pressure. He quietly believed they had found a better rhythm. What he didn't see was that Grace hadn't become more content. She had simply stopped placing expectations where they rarely survived. One evening, Michael arrived home earlier than usual. He walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Grace preparing dinner. Instead, their daughter was stirring a pot on the stove. "Where's Mom?" "Upstairs." "Everything okay?" She smiled. "Yeah. She goes up there after work a lot now." Michael nodded. "I'll say hello." He climbed halfway up the staircase before hearing soft music behind the closed door. He raised his hand to knock. Then his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Another email marked urgent. Michael sighed, answered it, and turned back toward the stairs. "I'll catch her later," he murmured to himself. Grace never knew he had been there. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she walked downstairs for a glass of water. She noticed the untouched mug of tea she had made for Michael sitting beside his laptop. The steam was gone. She poured it into the sink, rinsed the mug, and placed it back in the cabinet. No frustration, no tears. Only the quiet efficiency of someone who had begun adjusting her expectations before disappointment had the chance to arrive. Without realizing it, Grace had stopped asking for Michael's time. Michael mistook the silence for peace. Neither of them understood that the distance between two people rarely begins with an argument. Sometimes it begins the day one of them decides there's no point asking anymore. Michael's father had always been an early riser. Most mornings, he was already on the back porch with a cup of coffee before the rest of the house was awake. After his wife passed away, the routine became something he held on to. Grace often joined him before leaving for work, and those quiet mornings gradually turned into conversations neither of them planned. One evening, several weeks after the missed anniversary, he found Grace sitting alone on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was wrapped in a light sweater despite the warm North Carolina air. "You couldn't sleep?" he asked. Grace looked over and smiled. "I could ask you the same thing." He chuckled and lowered himself into the rocking chair beside her. Old habits. For a while, neither of them spoke. The crickets filled the silence more comfortably than words could. Finally, he glanced toward the upstairs windows. "Michael still working?" She nodded. "I think so." "You didn't wait up." "I used to." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a simple statement. He noticed the difference. "You've been carrying a lot." Grace looked down at the mug warming her hands. "We all carry something." "That's not what I asked." She smiled faintly. "You sound like your son." "I've had more practice." She laughed softly, then looked back toward the quiet street. "I don't want him to feel guilty every time work gets busy." "He probably already does. He loves this family." "I know," she answered so quickly that he turned to study her face. "He isn't choosing work because he loves you less," she continued. "He's trying to give us a good life." Michael's father nodded. "I believe that." "So do I." Another silence settled between them. After a few moments, he asked, "And what kind of life are you giving yourself?" Grace didn't answer right away. She watched a neighbor walk a golden retriever beneath the streetlights before speaking. "I haven't thought about that in a while." He leaned back in his chair. "Maybe it's time." She smiled politely, but didn't respond. The conversation drifted to the children, then to his garden, then to a recipe Grace wanted to try over the weekend. She had a remarkable way of steering attention away from herself without making it obvious. He noticed. He simply chose not to push. Over the next several months, the pattern repeated itself. Whenever Michael traveled, Grace and his father often ended the day on the porch. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply watched summer thunderstorms roll across the neighborhood. One night he asked, "Have you told Michael how lonely you've been?" Grace looked surprised. "I'm not lonely all the time." "I didn't say you were." She sighed. "I've tried." He waited. "At first I'd tell him I missed him. Then I'd suggest we spend a day together. Then I'd ask if we could have dinner without phones." "And?" "He always meant to." The words came with a small smile. "I know he did." "You believe that?" "I do." "Then why did you stop asking?" Grace looked toward the porch light. "Because I started recognizing the look on his face before I finished the sentence." "What look?" "The one that says he already feels bad." She paused. "I didn't want every conversation to become another reason he thought he was failing." Michael's father lowered his eyes. There wasn't much to argue with. She had protected Michael from disappointment, while quietly carrying her own. "You know," he said after a moment, "your mother-in-law used to tell me something whenever I worked too much." Grace smiled. "What was that?" "The people who love you shouldn't have to compete with the things you love." She let those words settle between them. I wish she'd told him. He smiled sadly. She probably thought life would teach him. Grace rested her head against the back of the chair. "I hope it doesn't teach him too late." Neither of them mentioned the conversation again. The next morning, breakfast unfolded as it always did. Michael rushed to finish his coffee before another meeting. The children argued over the last blueberry muffin. Grace packed lunches. His father watered the flowers by the porch. Everything looked exactly as it always had. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no obvious signs that anything was wrong. Michael kissed Grace before leaving. "I'll try to get home early." She smiled. "I'd like that." He believed her smile meant everything was getting better. His father watched from the front window as Michael drove away. Then he looked back at Grace, who was already clearing the breakfast plates before taking a single bite of her own. For the first time, He wondered whether the strongest person in the house was also the one disappearing the fastest. The room upstairs no longer looked anything like a storage room. Sunlight spilled through the single window each afternoon, catching rows of neatly arranged paintbrushes, jars of mixed colors, and canvases leaning against one wall. A folding table Michael had meant to throw away years earlier had become Grace's workbench. The old bookshelf now held sketchbooks instead of holiday decorations. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't perfect. It was hers. Most evenings, after dinner was finished and the dishes were put away, Grace climbed the stairs carrying a mug of tea and closed the door behind her. Downstairs, life continued as usual. Homework, laundry, television, emails. Upstairs, time felt different. She painted people more than places. A woman sitting alone on a porch. A father holding his daughter's hand outside a school. An empty rocking chair facing a sunset. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary moments that somehow carried more emotion than she could explain. She rarely showed anyone the finished pieces, not because she was embarrassed, because they felt too personal. One Saturday morning, while Michael was away at another conference, her closest friend Denise stopped by with coffee. "I've been trying to get you out for weeks," Denise said as Grace opened the door. "I know. You always have something else to do." Grace smiled. "Come upstairs." Denise stopped halfway through the room and slowly turned in a circle. I had no idea. Neither had anyone else. Canvas after canvas rested against the walls. Some were finished. Others waited for another layer of paint. Denise walked toward one, showing a family gathered around a dinner table. Only one chair was empty. She looked back at Grace. "These are beautiful." Grace laughed softly. "I still see all the mistakes." "I don't," Denise continued, looking around. "Have you ever thought about selling them?" Grace shook her head immediately. "People buy art from real artists." Denise folded her arms. "And what exactly are you?" Grace didn't answer. A week later, Denise arrived with a laptop. "Sit down." Grace frowned. "What are you doing?" "I'm helping." Before Grace could protest, Denise had created an online artist profile. "Use your own name," Grace said. Denise looked at her. "Do you want people from church calling you every time you post a painting?" Grace laughed. "Good point." After a few minutes, she chose a simple name that carried no connection to her everyday life. Just enough distance to let the work stand on its own. They uploaded 3 paintings. Grace didn't expect anything to happen. She closed the laptop and went back to making dinner. 3 days later, her phone buzzed while she was standing in the grocery store. "Your painting has sold." She stared at the screen, certain she had misunderstood. By the time she arrived home, there was another notification, then another. Michael happened to call while she was unpacking groceries. "Hey," he said, "how's your day?" It was interesting. "Oh?" She looked toward the staircase leading to the art room. "I'll tell you when you're home." "I might be late tonight." She smiled to herself. "That's okay. I promise we'll catch up tomorrow." "I know." After they ended the call, she placed the phone on the counter. For a moment, she considered calling him back, sharing the news immediately, telling him that something she'd poured herself into had connected with complete strangers. Instead, she finished putting away the groceries. The moment quietly passed. Over the following months, more paintings sold. The money wasn't life-changing. That had never been the point. What surprised Grace was the messages. People wrote about seeing themselves in her work. One woman thanked her for painting what loneliness inside a marriage looked like without making anyone the villain. Grace read that message 3 times. Then she closed the laptop and sat silently in the studio. It was the first time she realized she wasn't the only person carrying feelings she struggled to explain. She continued painting, not to escape her family, not to prepare for leaving, but because those few hours each week reminded her she was more than a calendar, a caregiver, an employee, or the person who remembered everyone else's needs before her own. She was still someone with a voice, even if it arrived through a paintbrush. One Friday afternoon, Denise called. "A group of us are having dinner tomorrow. You have no excuse this time." Grace smiled. "I appreciate it." "So that's a yes?" Grace hesitated. "I don't think I can." Is Michael out of town again? He gets back tomorrow. So, let him handle dinner. Grace looked around the quiet kitchen. It isn't that. Then what is it? She searched for an answer that sounded honest. Finally, she said, I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when people ask how we're doing. The line stayed silent for a moment. You don't have to pretend with me. I know. Grace looked toward the staircase. The studio door stood slightly open. An unfinished canvas waited inside. I think I'd rather paint. After hanging up, she carried her tea upstairs, closed the door behind her, and stood in front of a blank canvas. Downstairs, the house looked exactly as it always had. Upstairs, Grace finally allowed herself to admit something she hadn't said aloud to anyone. She wasn't giving up on her marriage. She was simply trying not to lose herself while waiting for it to find its way back. The first thing Michael noticed was that life seemed easier. Grace no longer reminded him about parent-teacher meetings. If he forgot to call when a flight was delayed, she didn't send a second text asking where he was. She stopped asking whether he'd be home for dinner. She simply made enough food for everyone, wrapped his portion, and placed it in the refrigerator before going upstairs. At first, Michael thought they had finally settled into a rhythm that worked. There were fewer tense conversations, fewer apologies, no disappointed sighs when work interrupted another evening. He even mentioned it one Saturday morning while they cleaned the garage. I think we're handling things better. Grace looked up from the donation box she was sorting. What makes you say that? We're not arguing anymore. She gave a small nod. No, we're not. He smiled, relieved to hear her agree. He didn't notice that she hadn't smiled back. The children noticed the change differently. Their daughter came into the kitchen one afternoon while Grace packed lunches for the next day. Mom? You and Dad okay? Grace looked up. Why would you ask that? You don't talk much anymore. Grace paused for a second before sealing another sandwich bag. We talk. About bills. Grace couldn't argue with that. Their daughter leaned against the counter. You used to sit on the porch after dinner. I remember. You don't anymore. Grace smiled gently. People change. Their daughter frowned as if she wanted to ask something else, but instead, she picked up an apple from the fruit bowl and walked away. That conversation stayed with Grace longer than she expected, not because her daughter had been wrong, because she had been right without realizing how long it had been happening. Michael continued believing the calm meant progress. From his perspective, home felt less complicated. Grace wasn't waiting for him to put away his phone. She no longer suggested weekend trips that usually had to be canceled. When work forced him to stay overnight in Raleigh for an unexpected client meeting, she simply texted, "Drive safely," nothing more. He stared at the message for a moment. No disappointment, no frustration. He smiled to himself. She understands. What he couldn't see was that Grace had stopped expecting a different outcome. One evening, Michael came home early enough to surprise everyone. The children were finishing homework at the dining room table. His father was watching the evening news. Grace stood at the stove stirring soup. For a brief moment, the house felt like it used to. Michael walked over and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I actually escaped the office. She looked at him and smiled. I'm glad you made it home. I thought maybe we could all watch a movie after dinner. Their son grinned immediately. Seriously? Seriously. Grace set the spoon down. That sounds nice. There wasn't excitement in her voice, only politeness. The difference was almost too small to notice. Dinner passed comfortably. The children argued over which movie to watch. Michael's father complained that nobody made good westerns anymore. Everyone laughed. Halfway through the movie, Michael's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The smile faded. I have to take this. Grace kept her eyes on the television. Okay. I'll only be a minute. He stepped onto the back porch. The call lasted 43 minutes. By the time he returned, the movie credits were already rolling. Their son had fallen asleep against his grandfather's shoulder. Their daughter was carrying empty bowls into the kitchen. Grace was wiping down the coffee table. I'm sorry, Michael said. The client, it's fine. She didn't stop wiping the table. We finished the movie. I know. I didn't expect the call to take that long. I know. He stood there, waiting for something else. A complaint, a question, an argument. None came. Grace folded the cleaning cloth, wished everyone good night, and walked upstairs. Michael watched her disappear around the corner. His father switched off the television and stood. Long day? Michael asked. For all of us. Before Michael could respond, his father continued toward his bedroom. The words lingered longer than the conversation itself. Later that night, Michael walked past the closed studio door. Soft music drifted into the hallway. He almost knocked. His hand even reached toward the door. Then his phone vibrated with another email. He answered it without thinking and walked back downstairs. Inside the studio, Grace never heard him stop outside. She added another careful brushstroke to a canvas that had occupied the easel for weeks. Without realizing it, both of them believed they were protecting the other from disappointment. Neither understood that every kindness built on silence was quietly widening the space between them. By the time the house finally fell asleep, the distance no longer felt loud enough to argue about. It had simply become part of the way they lived. Michael didn't arrive at the idea of divorce in a single moment. It found him through ordinary evenings that felt increasingly unfamiliar. He would come home, find the house running smoothly, eat the dinner Grace had left for him, and realize they hadn't had a real conversation in days. There was no shouting, no accusations, no obvious reason to believe the marriage was falling apart. That, somehow, made it harder to understand. One afternoon, a coworker asked him over lunch, "How's Grace doing?" Michael answered without thinking, "She's good." The words came easily. Only later did he realize he hadn't actually asked her how she was in weeks. He knew their daughter's college plans. He knew his son's baseball schedule. He knew his father's next doctor's appointment. He knew the quarterly goals at work. But when he tried to picture what had made Grace smile recently, nothing came to mind. He pushed the thought aside. People changed. Marriages settled. Wasn't that what everyone said? A few weeks later, he met an old college friend for coffee. Their conversation wandered from careers to children before landing on marriage. His friend stirred his coffee for a long moment. "My ex-wife and I stopped arguing years before we divorced." Michael looked up. "Really? We thought that meant things were getting better. What changed?" His friend gave a tired smile. "We stopped expecting each other to listen." The comment stayed with Michael during the drive home. That evening, he watched Grace helping their son study at the dining room table. She laughed when he answered a history question with complete confidence and absolute certainty that he was wrong. The sound filled the room. Michael realized he hadn't heard her laugh like that with him in a long time. He wanted to walk over, sit beside them, join the conversation. Instead, his phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer it. By the time he returned, homework was finished. Grace had gone upstairs. The opportunity disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. Over the next month, Michael began asking himself questions he had spent years avoiding. Maybe they had become different people. Maybe they were staying together because it was familiar. Maybe neither of them knew how to admit the marriage had already ended emotionally. The thoughts frightened him. They also felt strangely practical. He wasn't looking for another relationship. There wasn't someone else. He simply couldn't remember the last time Grace looked excited to see him. What he failed to ask was whether she had stopped hoping he would notice. One Friday afternoon, after postponing the decision several times, Michael searched online for a family law attorney. He stared at the screen for almost 10 minutes before making the call. The receptionist spoke kindly. She scheduled a consultation for the following Tuesday. When the call ended, Michael sat alone in his office. He expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt exhausted. The attorney asked careful questions. Had they tried counseling? Was there conflict? Were there financial disagreements? Michael answered honestly. No. So why divorce? The attorney finally asked. Michael hesitated. "I think we've drifted apart." The words sounded thinner once they were spoken aloud. The attorney nodded without judgment. Sometimes people arrive at that conclusion. Michael left carrying a folder of information he hoped he would never need. He placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk when he got home. Grace never saw him do it. That same weekend, while Michael was mowing the lawn, Grace stood upstairs in front of her largest canvas yet. It was wider than any painting she had attempted before. She worked slowly, stepping back every few minutes before adding another layer of color. Hours passed without her noticing. When she finally set the brush down, she looked at the finished piece for a long time. A woman stood at the edge of a quiet shoreline. Another figure was visible in the distance, walking toward the horizon. Neither faced the other. There was space between them that felt impossible to measure. Grace looked at the small card she always attached to the back of each painting before listing it online. She wrote only 2 words, "Still waiting." She stared at the title for a moment. Then she nodded to herself. It felt honest. Downstairs, Michael came inside, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass. He looked toward the staircase. "Grace? I'm upstairs. I'll be there in a minute." He climbed halfway before his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. Another client. He answered without thinking and turned back toward the kitchen. Upstairs, Grace waited for footsteps that never came. After a few minutes, she picked up a cloth, cleaned her brushes, switched off the studio light, and closed the door behind her. Neither of them realized they had spent the same afternoon trying, in different ways, to make peace with a life that no longer felt shared. A few days later, the attorney called to say the paperwork was ready. Michael told himself he was making the kindest decision for both of them. He never imagined Grace had been fighting for the marriage long before he convinced himself there was nothing left to save. Tuesday arrived without announcing itself. The children had gone upstairs after dinner to finish homework. Michael's father excused himself early, saying he was tired. The house settled into the familiar evening quiet that had become part of their routine. Michael stood alone in the kitchen. The folder rested on the table, exactly where he had placed it 20 minutes earlier. He picked it up, set it down, opened it, closed it again. By the time Grace walked in carrying her coffee mug, he had already changed his mind twice. She rinsed the mug, dried it carefully, and pulled out the chair across from him. "You wanted to talk?" Michael nodded. His throat felt unexpectedly dry. "Yeah." She waited. He looked at the folder one last time before sliding it across the table. "I don't know how to say this any better." Grace lowered her eyes to the first page. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Michael watched her face, searching for something. Confusion, shock, anger, anything. Instead, she turned the page, reached for the pen lying beside the folder, and signed her name where the first marker indicated. Then the second, then the third. The scratching of the pen across the paper seemed louder than it should have been. Michael leaned forward. "Grace." She finished the last signature, placed the pen neatly on top of the folder, and pushed it back toward him. "I hope this brings you the peace you've been looking for." Her voice was calm, not cold, not bitter, simply tired. Michael stared at her. "You're not going to say anything?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I've said it." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I don't think there's anything left to add." She stood, picked up her empty mug, and walked toward the staircase. Halfway up, she paused. Without turning around, she said, "Good night, Michael." Then she disappeared upstairs. He remained exactly where he was. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument he had rehearsed in his head. He had prepared himself for tears, prepared himself for accusations. He had even imagined her refusing to sign. He wasn't prepared for acceptance. Several minutes passed before he noticed something resting on the chair where Grace had been sitting, a small notebook. Its dark blue cover was worn at the corners, and faint streaks of dried paint marked one edge. He recognized it immediately. It had come from the upstairs room. For a moment, he considered taking it to her. She had probably forgotten it. He even stood, notebook in hand, and looked toward the staircase. Then he stopped. The house remained quiet. Slowly, he sat back down. His fingers hesitated over the cover before opening it. The first page wasn't a journal entry. It was a list. Anniversary ideas. Sunrise at the beach. Dinner at the little Italian restaurant. Turn phones off for one day. Ask Michael if he'd like to watch the old movie again. Every item had a small empty box beside it. None of them were checked. He turned another page. There were sketches of family vacations they had never taken, a drawing of the front porch with all 4 rocking chairs filled, notes about their daughter visiting colleges, ideas for surprising their son after baseball season ended. Another page held only one sentence. Remember to ask Michael how the presentation went. He looked nervous this morning. Michael swallowed hard. He kept reading. Some entries were only a few lines long. Others filled entire pages. None of them blamed him. None of them called him selfish. Instead, they captured ordinary moments he barely remembered. The night she waited with tea until it went cold. The picnic that never happened. The anniversary she spent eating dinner alone. The morning she almost asked him to take a walk before work, but changed her mind when she saw him answering emails. Near the back of the notebook, one unfinished page caught his attention. At the top, Grace had written, "Things I still hope we do together." Below it were only 3 lines. Watch one sunrise, grow old on the porch, learn how to find each other again. The rest of the page was blank. Michael closed the notebook and rested both hands on the cover. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel peaceful. It felt unfamiliar. Upstairs, he heard the faint sound of a paintbrush tapping against a glass jar. Grace hadn't cried. She hadn't argued. She hadn't tried to change his mind. And sitting alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers he had convinced himself were the responsible answer, Michael finally understood something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Grace's silence hadn't begun that night. It had begun years earlier. One unanswered invitation at a time. He never made it upstairs, and he didn't sleep at all. Grace moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town the weekend after the separation. It wasn't far enough to make co-parenting difficult, but it felt far enough that the drive home always seemed longer for Michael. The children settled into a routine more quickly than either parent expected. 1 week with Mom, 1 week with Dad, extra dinners together whenever schedules allowed. They adapted, because children often do. That didn't mean it was easy. The first Monday morning without Grace in the house began with 3 alarms going off before Michael realized none of them were his. His father called from the hallway, "Michael? I'm up." "You sure?" "I am now." He hurried downstairs to find his son searching for a missing baseball jersey. Their daughter stood by the refrigerator. "Are we out of yogurt?" Michael opened the door. Apparently, they were. His father cleared his throat. "I think I forgot my blood pressure pill." Michael looked at the clock. He was already running late. For years, mornings had somehow worked without anyone raising their voice. Now every task seemed to arrive at once. By the time everyone left the house, Michael realized he hadn't eaten breakfast. At work, he stared at his calendar and noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Every afternoon held another responsibility. Pick up prescriptions, order groceries, schedule the dentist, sign permission slips, call the insurance company, reply to the teacher's email. He found himself wondering when Grace had managed to fit all of that into a normal day. She never talked about it. She simply did it. That evening, he stopped at the grocery store with a handwritten list his daughter had left on the kitchen counter. Halfway through the aisles, he called her. "Do we usually buy the red pasta sauce or the blue one?" She laughed. "Mom gets the red." "Okay. And don't forget Grandpa's oatmeal." Michael looked down at his cart. It wasn't on the list. It never is. He stood there for a second after the call ended. There were dozens of things Grace remembered, without writing them down. The thought followed him home. A few days later, Michael's father sat with him on the back porch after dinner. The rocking chairs creaked softly in the evening breeze. "It's quieter," his father said. Michael nodded. "It is. You miss her." "I do." His father looked toward the empty chair Grace used to sit in. "You know what I miss?" "What?" "The way she noticed things before anyone had to ask." Michael didn't answer. "She'd refill my prescription 2 days before I remembered I needed it. If the weather turned cold, there was an extra blanket folded at the end of my bed before I even thought about it." He smiled faintly. "She paid attention." Michael lowered his eyes. "So did I." His father didn't argue. "You loved her." "I still do." "I know." Another silence settled between them. Finally, his father said, "Loving someone and seeing them aren't always the same thing." The words lingered after he went inside. That weekend, Michael opened the hallway closet looking for extra light bulbs. Instead, he found neatly labeled storage bins. Winter decorations, school keepsakes, medical records, tax documents. Each one had Grace's handwriting on a small white label. He stood there longer than he meant to. The organization hadn't happened by accident. Neither had the birthdays that were never forgotten, the pantry that always stayed stocked, or the appointments that somehow never slipped through the cracks. He had lived inside the results of Grace's effort for years. He had rarely seen the effort itself. The following Tuesday, his son walked into the kitchen carrying a permission form. "Dad?" Michael looked up from the stove. "I need this signed today." He took the paper. "When's it due?" His son blinked. "Today." Michael sighed. "I'll do it now." His son hesitated. "Mom usually signs things as soon as we bring them home." There was no criticism in his voice, only observation. Michael signed the form and handed it back. "Thanks." After his son left the room, Michael remained standing by the counter. He thought about how many times Grace had prevented small problems from becoming bigger ones without anyone noticing. The house still looked the same. The family photographs remained on the walls. The porch still overlooked the same quiet street. But everything required more effort than he remembered. Not because Grace had taken something with her, because she had been carrying so much that no one realized how heavy it was until she wasn't there to lift it anymore. For the first time since the separation, Michael stopped asking himself how the marriage had ended. He started asking a different question. How many invisible ways had Grace been loving all of them, while no one, especially him, had truly seen it? The notebook never returned to the upstairs room. Michael kept it in the drawer of his nightstand, not because it belonged there, because every few nights, after the house had gone quiet, he found himself opening it again. He stopped reading from the beginning. Instead, he opened it at random. One page held a list titled, "Things We Haven't Done in Too Long." Watch the sunrise, eat dinner without phones, take the long way home, sit on the porch when it rains. Nothing on the list cost money. None of it required a vacation. He closed the notebook and stared into the darkness. He couldn't remember why those things had always felt as though they could wait. Another page held a folded receipt from a small bakery. Tucked beneath it was a note in Grace's handwriting. Picked up Michael's favorite pie. Client meeting ran late. Froze it instead. Maybe next Friday. There was no next Friday written after it. The receipt was nearly 3 years old. Michael leaned back against the headboard. He remembered the meeting. He didn't remember the pie. A week later, while cleaning out the hall closet, he found a small storage box marked "Birthday Ideas." Inside were greeting cards, ribbons, wrapping paper, and pages filled with handwritten notes. Each family member had their own section: gift ideas, favorite meals, books they had mentioned wanting months earlier. He found his own page. It listed things he had casually talked about over several years: a biography he'd wanted to read, a fishing trip he'd once mentioned after seeing a television program, replacing the old watch his grandfather had given him. She had remembered conversations he had forgotten having. Standing there in the hallway, Michael realized something that hurt more than anger ever could. Grace had been paying attention even when he hadn't noticed she was listening. Meanwhile, life outside the house continued moving forward. One Saturday morning, Michael's sister called. "Have you seen today's paper?" "No. Why?" "Turn to the community section." He found the newspaper on the front porch. Halfway through the local arts page was a photograph of Grace standing beside several paintings during a regional exhibition. The headline read, "Local artist explores quiet moments of family life through paint." Michael read the article twice. It mentioned that her work had been selected for a regional showcase after months of growing recognition online. It praised the emotional honesty of her paintings. One sentence caught his attention. Her work invites viewers to consider the conversations families postpone until they become silence. He lowered the newspaper slowly. He hadn't even known there was an exhibition. That evening, curiosity outweighed hesitation. Michael drove to the gallery. He parked across the street and sat in his truck for several minutes before walking inside. The room was bright and surprisingly busy. People stood in small groups discussing paintings. Some leaned in close. Others simply stood quietly, taking them in. Michael slipped toward the back, hoping not to be recognized. Then he saw it, the largest canvas in the room. The title card beneath it read, "Still Waiting." He stepped closer. A woman stood near the shoreline beneath a pale morning sky. Far away, almost blending into the horizon, another figure walked in the opposite direction. Neither person appeared angry. Neither looked defeated. They simply no longer occupied the same place. The distance between them became the subject of the painting. Michael stood there without moving. Around him, conversations came and went. A couple paused beside him. The woman studied the painting for a long moment. "It reminds me of my parents," she said softly. Her husband nodded. "My dad always thought everything was fine because nobody argued." They moved on. Michael remained where he was. He looked at the brushstrokes, the muted colors, the empty space between the two figures. For the first time, he understood why Grace had spent so many evenings upstairs. She hadn't been hiding from her family. She had been giving shape to feelings she couldn't find another way to express. Someone approached from behind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Michael turned. An older volunteer smiled. It gets that reaction from a lot of people. Michael looked back at the painting. Did the artist say what inspired it? The volunteer shook her head. Only that sometimes the loudest part of a relationship is what never gets said. Michael thanked her and walked outside before anyone recognized him. He sat in his truck without starting the engine. The gallery lights reflected in the windshield as evening settled over the parking lot. For years, he had believed betrayal always arrived dramatically. Now he understood something different. A marriage could be undone by ordinary moments no one thought would matter. A postponed walk, a forgotten promise, a cup of tea left untouched. None of them seemed important on their own. Together, they had become a story he had never noticed, until someone painted it for the world to see. Michael waited almost 3 months before calling Grace. He started the call twice before ending it. On the third attempt, she answered, "Hi." "Hi." There was a brief silence. "Is everything okay?" She asked. "Yes." Another pause. "I was wondering if—" He stopped and tried again. "Would you have coffee with me sometime?" Grace didn't answer immediately. "To talk about the divorce?" "No." "Then, about what?" Michael looked out the office window. "I don't think we've ever talked about what actually happened." She let the silence sit between them. Finally, she said, "Saturday morning? I'll be there." They met at a small cafe near the park, where they had once taken the children to feed ducks. Nothing about the place had changed. The same wooden tables, the same chalkboard menu, the same bell above the front door. Grace arrived first. When Michael walked in, she stood and offered a small smile. "You look well." "So do you." They ordered coffee and sat near the window. For the first few minutes, they spoke about the children. Their daughter had chosen a college. Their son was excited about baseball season. Michael's father had started growing tomatoes again. It was familiar, comfortable, safe. Then the conversation slowed. Michael wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I didn't ask you here to talk about schedules." "I figured." He took a slow breath. "I've spent the last few months reading your notebook." Grace lowered her eyes. "I wondered if you had." "I shouldn't have opened it." "No." She looked back at him. "But I'm not angry that you did." Michael nodded once. "I kept waiting to find a page where you blamed me." "There isn't one." "I know." He looked down at the table. "That almost made it harder." Grace didn't interrupt. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't trying to solve the conversation before she finished speaking. "I thought I was taking care of my family," he said. "Every late night, every trip, I kept telling myself it was temporary." "I know. I believed that if I worked hard enough, everything else would fall into place." Grace traced the rim of her coffee mug with one finger. "I know." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me how bad it had become?" She smiled sadly. "I did." Michael frowned. "I don't mean once. I mean for years." She held his gaze without anger. "Every time I asked if we could go for a walk." She paused. Every anniversary I tried to protect. Every movie I hoped we'd watch. Every cup of tea that went cold. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. I thought those were small things. They were. She nodded. They were all small things. Another silence settled between them. Then Grace spoke so softly he almost missed it. That's why they mattered. Michael didn't have an answer. She continued. I wasn't waiting for expensive trips or grand gestures. I was waiting for ordinary moments. He swallowed. I thought there would always be another chance. I know. Her voice remained calm. But after enough later, you stop knowing what that word means. Michael looked out the window as a family crossed the street together. I convinced myself you didn't need me anymore. Grace gave a faint, tired smile. I needed you for a long time. What changed? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched steam rise from her coffee. Finally, she said, one day I realized I was rehearsing conversations in my head because they never happened in real life. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. I stopped talking because I couldn't bear hearing later one more time. The words landed without accusation, without anger, simply as the truth. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The sounds of the cafe carried on around them. Coffee grinders, quiet conversations, a child laughing near the counter. Life continued as though nothing remarkable had been said. Michael finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. Grace looked at him. I know you are. I don't expect you to forgive me. This isn't about forgiveness. No? She shook her head. It's about understanding. He nodded slowly. And I understand now. Grace studied him for a moment. I think you do. When they stood to leave, neither reached for the past. There were no promises, no requests to start over, only a quiet understanding that had arrived years too late for the marriage, but not too late for the truth. As Michael watched Grace walk toward her car, he realized the hardest conversations weren't always the loud ones. Sometimes they were the ones that finally happened after there was nothing left to defend. The divorce became final on a quiet Thursday morning. There were no raised voices, no last-minute arguments. They signed the remaining documents, thanked their attorneys, and walked out of the courthouse through different doors. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined 15 years earlier. It was simply the truth they had finally reached. Over the months that followed, Michael changed his routine in ways no one at work expected. He stopped answering emails during dinner. He declined projects that would have kept him traveling for weeks at a time. When a promotion requiring constant travel was offered, he surprised his manager. I'm staying where I am. You've worked toward this for years. I know. No regrets? Michael smiled faintly. I already know what that promotion costs. At home, he became fully present. He attended every baseball game he could. He never missed another parent-teacher conference. When his daughter called from college simply to talk, he closed his laptop before answering. His father noticed first. One evening, they sat together on the porch. You've changed. Michael looked toward the street. I had to. His father nodded. Your mother used to say people don't always learn from advice. Michael smiled. They learn from consequences. Meanwhile, Grace's life continued growing in quieter ways. Her paintings found new audiences. She began teaching weekend art classes at the community center, where children and retirees often shared the same room, laughing over spilled paint and unfinished landscapes. For the first time in years, she introduced herself simply as an artist, without feeling guilty for saying it. The children noticed the difference in both parents. One Sunday, their son looked around Michael's kitchen after breakfast. Dad, yeah? You don't check your phone all the time anymore. Michael looked at the device, lying face down on the counter. I've been practicing. His son grinned. Keep practicing. Michael laughed. I plan to. Neither Michael nor Grace spent their days hoping the marriage would somehow return. Instead, they slowly became the people they had once believed they already were, not together, but healthier than they had been when they were trying to survive inside the silence. Nearly a year later, the date arrived that had once belonged only to them. Michael remembered it before his alarm sounded. He drove across town carrying a small wrapped package. Grace's studio occupied the corner of a renovated brick building overlooking a tree-lined street. The lights were already on. She wasn't there yet. A young assistant arranging supplies looked up. "Can I help you?" Michael held out the package. "Would you mind giving this to Grace?" "Of course." "There isn't any rush." He thanked her and walked away before Grace arrived. Inside the package was a simple wooden frame. Behind the glass rested a yellowed sheet of paper from their first anniversary, the promise they had written together while watching the sunrise. No matter how busy life becomes, this day belongs to us. Attached to the back was a handwritten note. "I finally understand that love isn't measured by what we intend to give. It's measured by what the other person actually receives. I wish I'd learned that while we still had time. Thank you for every ordinary act of love I was too distracted to notice. Michael." Grace found the package later that afternoon. She stood alone in the studio after reading the note. Her fingers rested against the frame for a long time. Then she sat in the chair beside the window. She didn't cry because she wanted the marriage back. She cried because, after all those years of trying to explain herself through invitations, traditions, paintings, and patience, someone had finally understood what she had been trying to say. When she wiped away her tears, she placed the framed promise on a shelf overlooking the studio instead of packing it away, not as a reminder of what had been lost, as proof that being understood, even late, still mattered. Several months passed. Autumn settled over North Carolina. The trees lining downtown streets turned shades of gold and crimson. Grace held another regional exhibition. This time, Michael didn't hesitate outside the gallery. He walked in through the front door. Grace noticed him almost immediately. She smiled. "I'm glad you came." "I'm glad you invited me." They moved through the gallery together at an unhurried pace. There was no awkwardness left to manage. They talked about their daughter adjusting to college, their son's latest baseball tournament, Michael's father, who had finally admitted someone else made better peach cobbler than he did. They laughed. The conversation felt easy, not because the past had disappeared, because neither of them was trying to rewrite it. Before leaving, Michael stopped in front of one final painting. It showed two people sitting on neighboring rocking chairs at sunset. They weren't holding hands. They weren't looking at each other. But both chairs faced the same horizon. A small title card rested beneath the frame. He finally looked up. Michael stood there for a long moment before turning toward Grace. She met his eyes and smiled. He didn't ask whether the painting was about them. He already knew the answer wasn't important. Some stories end with people finding their way back to each other. Theirs didn't. Their marriage ended because years of ordinary moments quietly outweighed years of good intentions. Yet something meaningful survived. Michael learned that providing for the people you love is never the same as being present with them. Grace learned that rebuilding her own voice wasn't the same as giving up on love. They changed each other permanently, not by returning to the life they once had, but by carrying its lessons into every day that followed. And somewhere, in a quiet North Carolina neighborhood, where neighbors still waved from their front porches and children still rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, two people who had once promised to grow old together finally understood that the smallest moments are often the ones that shape a lifetime. Those moments ask very little, only that we notice them before they become memories.